Hi.
So it looks like we have 4 or 5 online.
Hey everyone, there's a little interference on this end, so I'm going to mute everybody, but thanks for joining us. We'll open up I'll unmute you guys when we do discussion later so you can participate.
Yeah, and maybe also when we're soliciting what people are bringing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We'll become closer, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll begin in 1 minute. Yeah. If you want to come in. Yeah. If you want.
So I can see all of you. Yeah.
We're good, strange, attractive, a diverse group, just in terms of experiences and specialities. Somehow we constituted this group, right? But doesn't, logically we don't make sense, so we're going to be hot.
From your mouth to God's ear.
Hi there.
Hi.
Thank
you. Is it okay to talk to me?
Yeah, sure. I think we'll begin. I'm just going to close the door. Oh, someone's going to close it. Thank you. Yeah. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Welcome. Well, I'm speaking first because I instigated the sessions.
It's fault.
It's my fault. My name is Gary Raucher. I'm faculty with the drama therapy program here at CIIS, but also very interested in these kinds of things. Been meditation teacher, things like that. So why don't we just do very brief introductions of ourselves right now, and then I'll just kind of set up what we had in mind, and then Felipe, our moderator, will kind of open it up to get a sense of what you're bringing, and then we'll go. So so that's me, Gary Raucher. I've been teaching here at CIIS for about 12 years now. I'm a teacher of a tradition called wisdom meditation with the Wisdom Fellowship. So that's kind of my angle into our broad definition of spirituality. And I'm very interested in how we bridge the depth component to embodied lived action in the world. But I'll come back to that when we set up the session.
Hi, everyone. First, apology for my dark glasses. I've forgot my regular glasses, so I've been being in my cool mode as some days. So my name is Joanne Gozawa, and I'm a core faculty member in the Transformative Inquiry Department, which is the online program that has a master's in transformative leadership and a doctorate in transformative studies. Why Gary asked me to be on this panel, I'm not sure, but my spiritual grounding, particularly for the last 10 years, has been in Jodo Shinshu Buddhism.
My name is Matt Segall. I'm an administrator who's on the staff here. I work up in the provost's office, and I'm also an adjunct faculty in the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program, where I've been teaching. This is my 3rd course this semester, and the course I'm teaching this semester is actually pretty applicable to our topic, I think. It's called Process and Difference in the Pluriverse. and it's an exploration of pluralism, not just cultural pluralism, that a kind of pluralism that I think a lot of us are used to, but ontological pluralism, the idea of there not being just multiple cultural perspectives on the world, but really multiple worlds. That's how different people are, and not just people, but other species live in their own worlds, and they all more or less overlap. But we're exploring some philosophical writings, some political theory, some ecological justice work to try to get at the relevance of this notion of pluralism to the various crises that we're facing socially and ecologically. So I'll probably talk a bit more about that in the next round.
That's super interesting. I'm Felipe Restrepo. I'm the program coordinator for the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and I am finishing the Bachelor of Arts completion program here, and will start my journey in the Integral Counseling Psychology program in the fall. And I'm very honored to have been asked to moderate this much needed conversation. I always believe this is one of the ones I think we need to keep having in many different contexts.
Thank you. So in a moment, we will open this up just to get a sense of what you're bringing so that we can incorporate that. And basically the structure today is we'll each kind of present a little bit more fully on our take of the confluence of social justice, anti-oppression, diversity, inclusion work, and the spiritual component of that, spirituality broadly defined. After that, Felipe will moderate the discussion amongst us and then open it up to you for your comments and questions. So that's our intended structure. In terms of what would provoke me to convene this, I mean, we know that at CIIS and in similar communities, it's not extraordinary or unusual to understand that spirituality, broadly defined, has relevance to social justice or anti-oppression work. I think if we look out at the broader society, the broader culture, there's kind of more of a splintering that happens. And I suspect that also even at CIIS, from just things I've picked up in different conversations, that some of those misunderstandings or some of that splintering or fragmentation does happen here, but it may be a little bit more sub rosa. So there's a recent book that came out by Shelley Totschlag called Living in the Tension. Some of you may be familiar with it. And she discusses some of the ways in which she has personally experienced these tensions, because she is a racial justice advocate and activist who is also a member of some spiritual communities of practice and has had experience in there. And she's detected a number of tensions that have arisen there. So just referring to my notes here, there are those who focus primarily on the theory and practice of socio-political action, but they don't necessarily understand the motives or the MOs of those who strive to locate activism within a spiritual, philosophical, or perhaps transcendental context. To intensely practical folks attempting to locate activism in some larger ontological context, to the intensely practical attempting to locate activism in some larger ontological context, it just may seem irrelevant, or it may seem frivolous, or an impediment to real work. You know. On the other hand, those who are looking to incorporate spirituality may find themselves experiencing impatience or judgment regarding a politically focused activist's perceived spiritual oblivion, you know, or experience their anger as self-sabotaging, or see that people who come at social justice work without the depth component are subject to burnout. So taking these considerations into effect, I thought it would be really valuable just to kind of look at these tensions and I think in my experience here, there's kind of a consensus that it doesn't have to be one or the other, that we can really have kind of a both and approach. And so that's what I think we're just trying to hopefully advance the conversation around that. Okay, so of course we are interested in finding out what you have and what you've brought into the room so that that can inform our discussion. So, okay,
Sure. Yeah, that's wonderful. Thanks for that framing. So yeah, I think we were expecting about 20 folks, and there aren't 20 people here. So the invitation is to to share your name and your kind of affiliation, student or faculty or staff or whatever it is, and then perhaps given the context that we're looking to deepen today today, you can share a little bit briefly about maybe what comes up with this kind of dance of the transcendental and the embodied, and just kind of so we can know you a little bit and what, just briefly, maybe like in 3 minutes or so. Would you like to start?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So my name is Josh. I'm a student in the ICP, Integral Counseling Psychology Master's Program here, first year. And honestly, seeing this talk on the schedule was one of the main reasons I chose to come today, because I really appreciate this reconciling, and I personally I have a fair bit of background in the more spiritual transcendence side. I studied philosophy and Eastern religions in my undergraduate degree. I see myself as a healer, and I've always had a bit of resistance around being labeled or identifying as an activist, just because of my temperament tends to be more peacemaking rather than standing up to something that needs to be changed. But so that's sort of where I'm coming from, but I really want to be open to social justice work, and I see this as kind of I'm hoping it'll be a bit of a bridge for me to enter the other side.
Well, thank you.
My name is Elizabeth Jennings, and I'm a PhD student in the Philosophy, Cosmology, Consciousness program. I've been here a while. I just finished my first comprehensive exam last semester, which was called Transcendence and Immanence in the Response of the Christian Psyche. So I saw this and like, wow, this is right what I'm thinking about.
Right.
I didn't bring my notes. So. And I have found in my own life and in my own reflections that transcending like social obstacles or transcending one's past personally requires a belief in ontological transcendence, unless you're going to be fissured down the middle. And so I've been exploring that, and I'm interested in how that can be communicated, because like you said, there's this idea that spirituality is a distraction, when I think it's actually the hidden impetus of the desire to transcend the obstacles or the brokenness in our lives. It rushes up from a belief in transcendence. So I've been exploring that.
Hi, I'm Madeline. I'm in the first year of the somatics program, and I identify as an anarchist and as a spiritual magician. And this work is very important to me. And I find in a lot of my conversations, I find a lot of polarity as well in the different circles I work in. And in my body is both. And in my life is both. So it feels important to continue to have conversations that bridge these worlds and speak the importance of both of them. And for myself, somatics came in much later in my life. I was raised Catholic, and I was raised with a lot of transcendence and a lot of, we don't pay attention to what's around us. We go elsewhere. And I became very, very good at going out of my body. So learning to be in my body and the connection of imminence for me is very important. And yeah, I'm just playing on the bridge between the two and happy to be in this room.
Unmute our digital folks.
Sure. You can turn the volume up there and then
Wait, what am I doing?
see the volume with the mouse. Yeah, anyone online that wants to introduce themselves briefly, just unmute yourself.
Thanks, Matt. Sorry.
Any takers?
Hi, it's Rick Tarnas, just tuning in and appreciating the topic. Can you hear me okay, Matt?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, great. Just appreciating you're addressing the topic and very interested in the different perspectives that are shared. I'm more interested in hearing than in contributing myself to. So this is a good opportunity for me. Thanks a lot for having it.
Hi, Rick. Thank you.
Thanks for being here, Rick.
That's great. Thanks, Matt.
Hi, can you hear me?
Sure can.
Oh, good. My name is Mary Claire Fecky, and I hope it's not too noisy. I'm actually driving right now from Bellingham down to Portland, but I'm super glad to be able to catch this by Zoom. I'm very interested in the topic, and I'm doing my dissertation right now in the Transformative Studies Department. Joanne Gozawa's on my committee, and so there she is. I can actually see you. What technology this is as I'm driving down I-5. Anyway, this topic, I've been looking back at journals from 40 years ago when I was a freshman in college and thinking about this spectrum between the contemplative life and the activist life and what it means to hold both in tension. And this is just obviously a theme that goes back a long ways, and I'm very excited to be here, and thank you. And will mute myself so you don't hear road noise.
I'll be safe.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Ashton. I am a PCC student. This is my first year. I am tuning in just similar to Rick to listen and to be made over by the perspectives you guys will be sharing. So I look forward to hearing.
Thanks, Ashton.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, hi, I'm Simone Marenholz. I am Associate Professor for Philosophy at University of Manitoba. And I am very interested in combining philosophy and spirituality more. And I'm also very interested in several of the topics that the CIIS pursues and follows. Among them, of course, the understanding of creativity in its many dimensions. So I could go on in what sense I'm interested in this topic, but I stop here. But yeah, I'm quite happy that I can be here virtually. And thanks so much.
Thanks for joining us.
Is that all the digital again?
Anybody else?
Cool.
Okie doke.
Hi, I'm Adriana. I am in the Master's in Social Psychology, my 4th semester. I'm from Brazil, and I was born kind of like between Catholicism and West African spiritualities and the blend between all of that. Mm-hmm. And now like I practice Eastern meditation practice. So like there's like all of this in my field, and sometimes I hold it with some feeling of being paradox, and sometimes things are kind of complementing each other. So yeah, I'm most curious about all of this, and I am a fellow in the Writing Center and a mentor in the Bridge program. So it just feels important to me to try to reconcile all the paradoxes possible, or not try to reconcile, but at least dialogue about that and why I am working with people. Yeah.
Thank you. We had you joining us when we're just trying to get a sense of who's with us, and if you just want to introduce yourself, your name, and your program, or whatever your
I'm a
affiliation
member
is.
of the community, so I'm not a student.
And did you want to share anything about your relationship to spirituality and social justice work and the intersection between those two things, or not? You're welcome to not.
Not at the moment.
Okay. Okay. Welcome.
Thanks.
Thank you for introducing yourselves. Thank you to the folks who are joining us remotely. The next part of our offering is our panelists are going to spend about 10 or so minutes each, 10 or 15 minutes, kind of deepening a little bit their own relationship to this dance, and get to hear a little bit more about what they have to say, what they have thought, and what their praxis has yielded in their lives and in their experience. So I'll leave it to you to decide who goes first. I will not dictate such things. Who would like to start?
Joanne asked you to go last.
Okay.
Do you want to go first, Gary? Or?
I'm fine with that.
Okay.
Okay. And I did prepare some graphics and slides for this. I think I'm the only one who did, so maybe we'll get that out of the way so we can take it down. I'm going to have to stand over here so I can advance my slides, so please make sure that you can see. Okay, so I was trying to think how to frame what I felt would be appropriate to offer on this subject. And so I'm putting it under the rubric of developing inclusive self-identification. And I think that'll get clarified as we go along. I want to start with this quote that I really, really love. It's from Alport, 1962. I came across it in a book called Multicultural Encounters by Stephen Murphy Shigematsu. It's a counseling book. I teach in a counseling program, drama therapy. But the author, Murphy Shigematsu, is quoting Alport. Every person is like all others, like some others, and like no others. So all of those are true. I'm seeing a lot of concurrence here. Okay, so with that in mind, my objectives for this talk are to relate our depth of self-identity. I'll clarify, I think, what I mean by the depth of self-identity to the ways that we approach oppression and its causes. And also to integrate surface and depth aspects of the ways we do self-identify to ways in which we approach activism. Those are my intentions, and they might seem a little bit abstract. You could hold my feet to the fire, but if anything seems too abstract, just call me out on it. So first, I wanted to acknowledge that there is a variety of depth approaches. So people mentioned growing up Catholic or different, different spiritual or religious or Buddhist or so many different frameworks. So this is an inclusive approach, but I wanted to kind of say more about my own positionality in this. As I mentioned in the beginning, I'm a practitioner, though I don't like labels very much. I'd say it's roughly aligned with the Western esoteric tradition. What I practice is something called wisdom meditation. There's a branch that's related to this called wisdom therapy. But I wanted to kind of clarify what wisdom means to me, because that's a very generic term. So I was kind of grappling with a lot of different definitions of wisdom, but this is kind of what my understanding is. That wisdom is the understanding and the effort to relate purpose or meaning as we perceive it to our actions. Okay, and so I think that we find ourselves, at least this is my experience, kind of standing as a mediator in my attempt to understand, to be conscious, trying to mediate between an intuitive sense of purpose or meaning in life and my embodied actions, what I do in life. And there's kind of a rotational effect here that my actions, if they are congruent with my sense of meaning, strengthen that sense of meaning and deepen it. And my actions only can really be formed in an incoherent way if I'm attending to my intent, my intuitive sense of meaning and purpose. And the meditation that I practice and that I'm fortunate enough to be able to teach is an alignment process. So it's aligning the personal self to the deeper self, and it's the deeper self that allows us to, I think, intuit with some sense of confidence, purpose or meaning in life. It's not intellectually derived, it's intuitive. Now, talking about self-identity, self-identification, I think, brings up, by association, the topic of identity politics, all its polarizations, and also the ways in which we approach the problem of oppression. So I want to talk a little bit about how ways in which we self-identity and the depth to which we self-identify is going to be a reflection of the way we approach an understanding about what oppression is. First of all, when we talk about self-identity in the social activism, social justice activism sphere, very often we come across the idea that we have intersectional identifiers. These is just, there's many more intersectional identifiers possible. This is just a random selection, you know, gender, race, ethnicity, class, religion, health, ability, status, sexuality, and many, many more. There's a social justice model called the addressing model by Pamela Hayes. It talks about how in any particular segment of our intersectional identities, we may experience either being in a position of power and privilege or you know, in a position of marginalization and subjugation. However, all of these layers, all these intersectional identifiers, however, they're descriptors of who we are in the social sphere, in the realm of personality interactions. And in a moment, I'm going to talk about how I don't think that that really suffices. Now, this is a reflection of the way I think people approach oppression. There are different lenses for approaching and understanding the causes of oppression. So if we look from the political sphere, it's really about the power dynamics, who holds power. We talk about sociological and economic, it's about who, you know, who is exploiting others, you know, who is sociologically positioned in a position of privilege. And the upper half of this seems to represent more of the collective or the socios. The lower sphere also involves the collective, but it's more individualistic. So then you can say, well, there are also lenses for looking at oppression. You know, we have to look at psychology. What is it about human psychology that leads to oppressive behaviors? There are spiritual and moral approaches. There's wisdom lore, ontological, metaphysical, and so on. So, you know, this is a very convenient pie for looking at that. But as I was kind of grappling with this, I realized that this is the wrong way to look at the pie. What we really want to look at is the pie and its many layers. And I think this is a more attractive looking pie in any case. So, following through on this analogy and foregoing the flatland analysis, you can see here, and this in itself is also something of a reduction, but I think it gets a little bit closer to what I'm trying to do. So up here, there's the upper layers of the pie, where we've got these political, economic, cultural, sociological, phenomenological aspects of understanding what oppression is caused by. You know, and a lot of people, a lot of activists are going at it and trying to find solutions at this upper level. And then, you know, there are the people who are going at it more from the level of consciousness, which I would say relative to the upper upper half of the pie. The lower layer is more of a causal layer. This is where we have also the factor of depth psychology, which may be kind of more where the crust is. So that's maybe called the psycho-spiritual ontological. So it's not like the upper layer is irrelevant, but it's like, how do we, again, this both and kind of spirit, how do we kind of incorporate the many layers of the pie? Okay, so I think what's important about the lower layer of the pie, and the fact that it is kind of a more causal layer, is that, especially if you look from, the more depth psychology, the spiritual, moral, the metaphysical, we could say in a lot of wisdom teachings, in a lot of spiritual teachings, that the core delusions that lead to oppression in human beings are separatism, fear, and greed, which are states of ignorance, states of not being in touch with the more inclusive perspective that is possible by tapping into the depths of being, the ontological resources that are available to us, not easily, but that with choice and with effort. So how does this relate to developing an inclusive self-identification? So again, I think if we look at the intersectional personality identifiers and the persona expression, if we only self-identify at that level, we're going to be caught up in those kind of polarizations and the emotional reactivity that comes from having difference and not understanding how that difference relates to wholeness. When we look at the depth layer, I think the depth layer, whatever we call it, spirit, soul, wisdom, ontological unity, whatever, that is the depth, that is the layer, and calling it a layer is really insufficient, but calling it in something that underlies, that is where the capacity to resolve the core delusions is that lead to oppression, polarization, misunderstanding, and all that follows. So we need this both and inclusive self-identity. The intersectional layers, they're important, but they're the persona, they're the appearance layer. And then what we might call psyche, or the depth, that's the causal layer. That is our emergent spiritual identity. Neither is the complete picture. It's together, the wholeness that enables us to actually operate in this world of appearances with a connection to what we might call source. So now we have these dualities that perhaps are resolved by being able to hold ambiguity of personality and soul, of the individual and the universal. So how do we practically cultivate this both and consciousness? Well, then there's the practices that people have that actually lead them, and this is a very individual matter. How do we enter onto that path that leads us to discover our path and the practices that tap depth consciousness? I would say that these practices are the royal road, to co-opt Freud, but they're the royal road to inclusivity, to the superconscious, if not the subconscious. And this inclusivity is horizontal, taking us from the me to the we, and it's vertical, taking us from individuality to universality, and then back to individuality. This is an evolutionary and developmental process that we can cooperate with through choice. And love and patience are needed. And I think with that, I'm going to just, I heard this from a student the other day, and I love this. This is what love actually is an acronym for. Let others voluntarily evolve. And we can substitute ourselves for others. How am I doing at time?
It's probably a good time to
Okay,
transition.
great. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thanks, Gary. So I assume we'll hold questions till the end and improve our dialogue.
That feels good. Yeah.
Thank you, Gary, for laying out a perspective on how to reconcile these big words, transcendence and imminence. What I'm going to do in my 10 minutes here is just try to offer some working definitions of some of the terms in this title, not because I pretend to definitively explain what these terms should really mean and how you should understand them, but just as some posts so that we can engage in a more fruitful dialogue, some guideposts. If you don't like them, we can pick them up and move them. So I'm not going to try to define transcendence and imminence directly. I think their meaning will surface as I go through trying to define spirituality, society, and justice. Spirituality is, it can mean so many things, right? We need to be very pluralistic when we attempt to understand what spirituality means. Often it will be opposed to religion. I think especially in a place like San Francisco, in California, and the New Age culture in general, a lot of people like to say, well, I'm spiritual but not religious. So spirituality is defined as not religious in the sense that religion would be more about a commitment to a very specific community with a set of very specific doctrines and teachings that one of these spiritual but not religious people might consider dogmatic. Spirituality would be more individual, more self-created. It's about inward work, inner work, understanding one's own depths, perhaps. Certainly, there's no reason that spirituality and religion can't be part of the same person's practice and engagement with, with God or the mystery or the ground of being, what have you. When I Googled spirituality and social justice, actually what came up were about 15 different Catholic university theological programs. So Catholic universities are doing most of the work on this intersection, it would seem, at least according to Google, from Google's perspective. Women's spirituality here at CIIS also came up on the front page, so that was nice. So there's no reason that spirituality needs to be defined against religion, though often in our particular historical moment it has been. And I would say spirituality generally has to do with transcendence, and transcendence is it's a vertical axis, right? It doesn't necessarily mean transcendence up and out. It could also mean a form of transcendence that's down and in. In any case, it's spiritual transcendence would be a form of transcendence that takes us beyond our skin-encapsulated egos to something more, whatever that more may be. So society then has more to do with this notion of immanence. It's a rather than a vertical axis, it's a more horizontal axis. It has to do with our relation to one another. And whereas spirituality and transcendence, these have a more eternal kind of feel to them. We're relating to something eternal. When we talk about society, our relations to one another, there's a deeply historical dimension to it. And our sociality situates us in these shared histories of coevolution. And this coevolution, for most of human history, has, as William James referred to it, it's been a bath of blood, right? Oppression, hegemonic exploitation. Peace has always been an interval between war. at least for the so-called civilized phase of our species. What happened before agriculture may not really classify as war. We can talk about what would define something as war or not, but in any event, we know history has been a bloody affair, and we're today, with our current set of social relations, dealing with tremendous injustice. Maybe we've made some improvements. There's plenty of work yet to be done. But there's a lot of disagreement about even whether or not our current system has improved things, whether there's more justice in our world today than there was hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago. There are different takes on that, right? So justice then, what is justice? Plato wrote a whole dialogue about this, the Republic, trying to figure out what justice is. And after a few hundred pages, it's not clear to me after reading the Republic what Plato thinks justice is. Something to do with a harmonious relationship between individual souls and their city or their polis, right? Something to do with a harmonization between what our conscience tells us is right and fair, and what occurs in our society, among others, with power structures that seem to lack justice. I think it's a lot easier to recognize injustice than it is to say exactly what justice is, other than fairness or equality. We know injustice when we see it, but it seems difficult for everyone to agree on what justice is. Cornel West famously said that justice is what love looks like in public. I love that. Martin Luther King said something very similar, that justice is love correcting that which revolts against love. Justice is love correcting that which revolts against love. So, for me, applying spirituality to social justice work would mean the task is to translate our moral ideals into social realities in a way that doesn't presuppose that I know what is moral. I know that as an individual, I have certain internalized forms of, I've internalized certain forms of oppression and of oppressor type behaviors. I've internalized white supremacy, I've internalized homophobia, I've internalized all these social habits that we've inherited for thousands of years as a result of, patriarchy, as a result of capitalist social relations, so many factors, right? That's all inside of me. So when I react to a situation and feel that it's unjust and I want to act to rectify it, I can't be sure that even if my heart is in the right place, that my action will necessarily alleviate the problem. So I think for people like me, that leads to a certain kind of hesitancy, as you were saying, Josh, to get into the fray as an activist and commit to a specific cause. There's usually a community around that cause that has a very specific way of languaging it, very specific demands, very specific enemies that are defined. And, it's difficult for me to not second guess myself. There's some issues that are clear, but the more you look into it, the more murky it becomes. So I have I wish things were such that I could just go within myself and tap into this causal consciousness that you were speaking to, Gary. Maybe my meditative practice isn't strict enough, or maybe I just need to try to go deeper into myself. But I have difficulty finding that causal place within myself that might be the cure for all of the various social ills that we're facing. Somehow I feel like part of our struggle it's a struggle for mutual recognition. And I can't do that on my own. It doesn't matter how deep into myself I go, it doesn't help achieve what another way of talking about social justice might be, which would be mutual recognition. I want to be recognized by you as a free, creative being, and you want to be recognized by me as a free, creative being. And we need each other in order to recognize each other as such. So there's an intrinsically social dimension, I think, to each of our spiritual evolution, you might say. So I can't do it on my own. Martin Luther King said something else that I really appreciate, which was that I can't be who I'm supposed to be until you are who you're supposed to be, and you can't be who you're supposed to be until I am who I'm supposed to be. So we're bound up in this struggle for mutual recognition. So I don't think there are any easy solutions to that other than engaging with each other in dialogue like this, with an ethic of what a political theorist I enjoy, William Connolly, calls presumptive generosity. Lots of times when we get involved in activist work, again, we label a certain group of people or a certain ideology as the enemy. And whenever we engage anyone who might be the slightest bit sympathetic to someone that believes that, they're the enemy. And we can't engage with an ethic of presumptive generosity that, well, maybe I need to talk to this person first and see what's at stake for them, see what their values are, see why they might still be friends with this person that I don't like, or see why they might not be on the same side as me on a particular issue. And it requires relaxing, on some level, these more surface identities. So it's a question of how deep do these forms of identity go? I don't think they're all on the same level, so to speak. And also, I think bringing spirituality to social justice work would mean, at least for those of us with the privilege to do so, trying to engage the work with joy rather than rage. Now, some people aren't as privileged as, say, I am, and couldn't engage in some struggles with joy. There's justified rage and anger. I'm not trying to say that that's not the right way for some people to engage these difficult issues. But for those of us with the privilege to do so, I think injecting some kind of joy and celebration, I'm thinking of like the Occupy protests, where there was an enactment of a different way of life, a gift society, a fully participatory, consensus-building democracy, right? It wasn't just critiquing a system, it was bringing forth a better way and expressing the joy of that other way of being. I think that's an important way that spirituality can inject social justice activism with joy, so that when we do succeed in tearing down oppressive structures, we have some inclination as to what to put in its place. It's very easy for the revolutionaries to become the new oppressors if they're not engaging in the work from a place of not just hatred for what has been oppressive, but a clear vision of what a more enjoyable way of life might look like. So I think I've said enough, and look forward to engaging with everyone in discussion. Turn it over to Joanne.
Well, I have no answers either. Can I use that board?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. So I have no snappy slides. Thank you, Gary. And I'm not as eloquent as Matt. My spirituality is really every day. So maybe let me start there. And, see what wants to present itself. Maybe we'll start with, it's so easy to categorize and make categories that hold our judgments, that maybe I'll do a little magic and try to dispel categories. So I introduced myself as a Jodo Shinshu Buddhist. Jodo Shinshu is one of the more popular Buddhism sects in Japan. And so people can say, that makes me feel comfortable. That matches the way she looks, Jodo Shinshu Buddhist. Okay, that's all great. We're all comfortable with that. Well, I didn't start out as a Jodo Shinshu Buddhist. My father was a Southern Baptist. My stepmother was Catholic. Somewhere along the line, I was confirmed. Right? My first husband was Muslim. My current partner of 20 plus years as kind of the grandparent that were evangelical. So now I hope the categories break up a little bit to say that we're all very complicated in our experience. And so what is spiritual? And thank you, Matt, for this idea of, especially at CIIS, we want to say, oh, we're not religious, we're spiritual. Okay. And yet, for the last 10 years, my spirituality is grounded in organized religion, in this Jodo Shinshu Buddhism. So, what is spirituality? And then to question rather than, to be an inquiry about what justice is, I think is important. It's the mind of inquiry that keeps us just not the mind open, but hopefully the heart open to all the differences that portends. And I do teach a class called Leadership, Pluralism, and Creativity, Diversity and Action. And I'm always amazed at, my story of multiple categories is reflected in my students. So we are coming from a very rich and complex place. So let me start with that.
There's some in the little basket of colors.
Yeah, okay. We're talking about. I really struggled with how to present this and how to share. And I always like to talk about what's immediately up for me, because that seems to come up the most present with most of my presence and authenticity. So I will say that we're coming upon the spring equinox. And so what Jodo Shinshu Buddhists are aware of is something called, Japanese Buddhism is interesting because when Buddhism came from, probably from China into Japan in about 800, there was already Shintoism in Japan, which is a earth-based indigenous religion. Japanese culture, given the way it is, said, great, more the merrier. So their Buddhism is very much influenced by Shinto, and actually in Japan, people are usually, the young people say we're quite a secular country, but culturally and aesthetically, it is a Buddhist Shinto country, and people have no problem holding that diversity. The national religion for maybe political reasons is Shinto, but people always go to their Buddhist temple, particularly for funerals. And for Ohigan, Ohigan is an honorific. Higan means it always happens in the equinox, the spring equinox and the autumn equinox. And again, here's the Shinto influence. During the equinox, it's the balance. It's, the weather is getting milder. And if you come from an agrarian culture, it's the time where you don't have to struggle so much to survive. Right? So it's the time to have the opportunity, the space to think about deeper things than just survival. And so that's what Ohigan is about. And one of the stories that they like to tell in Ohigan is this one. Let's see. So, this is a river. Higan actually literally translated means the other shore. The other shore. And so the idea is this life, this mundane life is this shore. This is where all the suffering is. This is where impermanence and death and frustration, this shore. Now, the historical Buddha developed a dharma, a message that said, go to the other shore. And a spiritual personification is the Amida Buddha. This is Buddha of compassion and wisdom. It is not a deity, it's more a cosmological presence. A cosmological presence of wisdom and compassion. And so Ohigan is celebrating that the Buddha Dharma says, go to the other shore. And Amida Buddha says, come to the other shore. So this is one of the stories in Buddhism in general, but particularly in Jodo Shinshu Buddhism. And this is the path. And the path is, is this dharma, is this message to go to the other shore. It seems quite narrow. But there's a couple of things that I want you to recognize in this kind of spirituality. One is, it is transcendent in the way that you were saying, Matt, kind of from the inside out. This is not a ladder. This is, things that are recognizable. We have a river, we have a shore. It's all like things that are here, right here on earth. And there's a thing in Jodo Shinshu Buddhism that says something about, if we're not going to awaken in this life, what life are we going to awaken to? It's like, it's here. This is it. In Shin Buddhism, there's no reincarnation. It's all here, right? And it's what they call Mahayana, Pure Land Buddhism. So this other shore is kind of considered the Pure Land. But, as a prevailing Christian country, we might think about that as heaven, but that's not it. This is the equanimity. Okay, this is equanimity. This shore is suffering. This is not the elimination of suffering, but the being with suffering in a way that we can persevere. So what does this have to do with social justice? The idea is that in oppression, it is suffering. But in my view, this spiritual practice is kind of sustainability for my action. Because this is in my mind, is a religious epistemology. And I think other traditions hold it as well. Religious epistemology to me is, well, maybe particularly in this religion and sect, there's no idea of you're going to do it because there's going to be a good result. There is you act because you're called. You're called to an abiding compassion. And so what else can you do? You know, you see the hurt, you know, we're all moved by suffering. We're all moved by suffering. And we hesitate because we feel like, is it going to be enough? You know, we're attached to the outcome, right? And so we say, no, we do it because being human, that's what we do. And in this life, maybe it's a good result, maybe it's not. But if we are unattached to the outcome, we are liberated from the suffering of the anxiety of worrying about it, and our actions can be sustained. How many of us say, it's not turning out, so I give up, right? Or I'm burned out, or you know, but if you hold it in a way that says, you know, you're foolish, ignorant being, you're probably going to fail anyway. But you know, there's this abiding compassion that doesn't care whether you fail or you succeed. It holds you, and if you can connect to it, if you can awaken to that compassion, then you will act in your sphere of influence and do what you do. So my sphere of influence is very much my degree concentration is in integral studies, transformative learning. And so what does it move me to be? If I'm connected to the abiding compassion, I can bring compassion and caring into my classroom, into the environment of learning, such that students respond to that, right? So transformative learning is a very scary proposition. You know, in fact, this is what actually moved me to Buddhism. And I must say that this sect of Buddhism is not a meditative, it doesn't meditate, you know, it's just cultivate appreciation and humility and gratitude and keep on listening. So it's less egoic, it's less, oh, I'm gonna do it. And it's more like, oh, I gotta receive here. So my action in the world is to be a transformative learning instructor, person for moving students to really question their assumptions and to be able to engage these differences in that way. And when I first started out with this, I was not Buddhist, and I found that, you know, students couldn't go there. And if my classes were very diverse, it ended up in, you know, it became a competition for who was right. And so I was not holding the space as I should be able to, being a transformative learning instructor. But in this practice of listening now and cultivating, connecting to the compassion, of the abiding compassion, and being able to evoke that in an environment of learning, changes the student's ability to hear and be with difference. Okay. So for me, they're not different. They're they're wedded to each other. I think because we're human, we will always do action, whether it's social justice action or just action in the world, through our suffering or through our vulnerability to suffering. You know, it moves us to act. The fear of to suffer or actual suffering does move us to act. But do we also do that action? You know, I was telling you, there's a word in Japanese, shikataganai. You know, you try very hard to grow rice in Japan, but rice came from China and Korea where it's conducive to grow rice. Not conducive to grow rice in Japan, but it's their diet, right? And so they know that you can try your best. You can be a good person, try your best, be collaborative with the neighbors, and your rice crop might still fail. It can't be helped. It can't be helped, right? So in my classroom, you know, if we can let go of how it's supposed to be, I can let go of my assumptions, my students can let go of their assumptions, and feel that abiding compassion, then I feel like they are more engaged with the work that needs to happen. So I will stop there for now.
Well, in that spirit, and not being attached to how things are supposed to be, we don't have a great amount of time left, and I think instead of trying to interject any of my own sort of things to moderate anything, we can just open it up and do what we can with the time we have to surface anything from the audience, virtual audience, and in person, and try to have a dialogue between the three of you. Anything coming up in the room?
Need to address this. They should be able to unmute themselves.
Oh, okay. Yes, please. I do have kind of an idea of maybe getting it started, if that's okay with everybody. I didn't want to just leave everybody out. What's the consensus? Okay. So maybe this will generate some conversation. And I want to, if possible, start with Matt. And I want to ask you, because you mentioned that your orientation sees the plurality of realities as perhaps what is happening here. So my question, though, is where is equality? If equality is perhaps just at least provisionally a way that we can understand the outcome that we want from social justice work, that there be equality. You mentioned that in one of the criteria for what might be justice. If our ontological, meaning being, if our being is essentially different, and correct me if I'm not misunderstanding where you're coming from in terms of plurality, but how do we gauge equality? And this is in the question, or kind of like this offering of how we can start the dialogue, is because I think that oftentimes spirituality claims that through practices, we will transcend the idea of difference or the illusion of separation or these kinds of things that are discussed in this way, and see, glean, touch, get in touch with. And a lot of us have said, like, well, once we come from this angle or that angle, the ground of being as being the essential nature that holds all the difference is one of the ways in which spirituality is grounded. But perhaps there's a different way of understanding it that might be more conducive to successful social justice work.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, I think certainly the notion of deep pluralism and equality as one way of defining justice. On the face of it, there's a bit of tension there. On the other hand, we can distinguish between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. It's a typical way of looking at the difference between how we have certain legal protections in place that are trying to provide for an equality of opportunity for all individual human beings. And we have a lot of work to do as a society to continue to assure equality of opportunity for people of all genders, for people of all races and sexual orientation and so on. But will we ever have equality of outcome? I don't think so, because everybody's different. Everybody has different capacities, and on some level, what allows society to be an interesting place, allows for creativity, is that you know, a bit of competition when the ground rules are set, I think is okay. If it's in the spirit of all of us improving one another. So equality doesn't mean that we're all the same, or that achieving a just society would mean that we all drive the same exact car and live in the same exact kind of house and wear the same clothes and so on. But I think, you know, my idea of a just society would be one wherein certain basics were considered to be rights that every individual have a right to.
But the right is not the right based on the idea that we're spiritually the same or equal.
You could, yeah, I think you could phrase it that way. I mean, in our classical liberal tradition in the European West, there was that. It was basically a spiritual ideal that each individual is created by the divine and has these God-given rights. They're not rights given by the state or given by society. They're God-given. And that the state and society should act to protect those. So there's a spiritual belief system built into how justice has been sought in the European, North American context, for sure. And I think in many other traditions, there'd be some version of that. Yeah. At our core, we all deserve to be recognized as free, creative beings. But see, maybe what makes us all equal is the fact that we have this capacity for creativity and freedom to express ourselves in the unique way that only we can. So pluralism, and so we're all equal in that we have this creative capacity, but we're all different in that what we do with that capacity, how we express ourselves, how we make ourselves, that's unique for each one of us. Each one of us is once occurrent. No one's ever existed just like us, and yet we all have that in common.
As Gary, you were mentioning in your depth pie chart, something to the effect that your definition of wisdom is the alignment of the ideals. You might have said this too, in the sense, the ideals coming to bear in the practical. I guess that I'm asking that because, why am I asking that? Or mentioning that? Well, because what you said is very beautiful just now, and I believe that maybe one of the tensions that occurs is that we're not talking about a similarity arising out of our creative capacity, but there is always some kind of claim of an ontological sameness that becomes problematic. An interpretation of what you said. Do you get what I'm driving at?
No, I think it's important to make a distinction between sameness and source. And there's a myth I can very briefly kind of recount, a creation myth that I've always been fascinated with. And it was told to me, and the person who told it was in a conference session, and they did not know which culture it came from. So I'm sorry about that. But this myth is that in the beginning, the Father God, in the persona of the brilliant sun, wanted to see himself reflected, in some kind of manifest form, and that a mother goddess provided a mirror for Father, Son, God to see himself, but that the intensity of his heat and light was such that the mirror just shattered into a gazillion pieces. And that the pieces all were reflecting that light and that brilliance, but each one was a different shard of a different clear shape. They got scattered to the four directions, and were very bewildered by their differences, and they're on this path of trying to understand how it is that they relate, how they're here in their difference, but all somehow reflecting that, especially as they dust themselves off, there's this luminous something about them. So I don't see that as sameness. I see that as a recognition of maybe an implicit oneness under the difference.
Joanne, anybody else? Anything come up?
Yeah, thank you to all of you. It was very nourishing hearing this conversation, because I've heard a lot of the surface level stuff lately, yeah, where do I want to start? And thank you to Matt for bringing up the murkiness of exploring what justice is. I feel like that often gets bypassed in these conversations. And this recognizing our own paralysis and our own confusion, I think, is a great place to start. And dialogues can begin there. With mutual confusion is a great start to dialogue.
With respect, yeah.
Might be part of that mutual recognition, that you were talking about. And you also talked about joy and rage, and engaging from joy or from rage. And my view is that rage is a step on the way to joy. And I've operated within this sort of three-tiered worldview for a while, that's both metaphysical and practical, of first you're just kind of on the surface of focusing on the good stuff and trying to ignore the difficulties, and you're in a very vulnerable place if something happens to you, and then you go down to the difficulty and the suffering and the entirely imminent contracted space, and then below that would be where the rage is, I think, and then below that is the place of redemption and forgiveness, and where you're able to recognize that imminent space I don't believe it's an illusion. But I do believe it is not the deepest truth. And making that distinction has been very helpful for me to carry that tension, that there is this ugliness and these problems and these sort of complex social relations. And there is also the deeper level at which we're shards of the image of God, and that both of those are real. And but I do think, though, that the oneness is the foundational reality, and you all express that so well. And one thing that your presentation, Gary, right, brought up for me was, I was actually talking about this with somebody pretty recently, trying to explain something like your diagram, but I didn't have it. And I was like, oh, that's what I meant. I would love to get a copy of that if I could, like the diagrams. That there's the level of economic and societal, power privilege stuff, and then there's the moral psychological oppression. And I think something that comes out of there, that I'd be curious to hear your opinion about, is that there becomes a reversal at some point where you realize that the oppressor is the most oppressed, spiritually, psychologically. which is something that I feel is often lacking from these conversations about power and privilege and oppression. And I think of like Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, who lived through the Holocaust, and he said, when you reach a certain level of ethical development, you'll no longer say he is an evil man. You will say he is a man in need of great love. And I'm just like, that is a very high level of ethical development, but I feel like if we don't keep that kind of awareness of the oppressor as deeply spiritually oppressed, that we lose perspective to do things in a helpful way. And I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
I love that framing of Martin Buber, and yes, it resonates. It does resonate for me in my practice, and this is where the concepts of karma are very resonant for me. And I don't know about but I mean this is, and it's very much a topic that's discussed in my practice. We have a teaching that when we encounter someone who is not people or movements or a presentation of others that are seemingly noxious and toxic and bad for the whole, really. What is that other than a being in great suffering calling out for compassion and assistance and modeling? And we have ample opportunity for that today, fortunately or unfortunately. I mean, to make this very personal, I have struggled for a long time not to be rageful and hateful in my attitude towards not only the president, but the whole coterie, the whole entourage, and not for the base, but for what it represents. And I'm grateful that little bit by little bit through practice, I've been actually able to feel compassion, experience compassion for him, and also coming to a realization that this is actually the work that is very important for me to do for myself and for whatever that contributes subjectively to a shift in the field. I don't know if that answers you.
Well, it was just, I wasn't looking for a particular answer.
Yeah, but that's what comes to me.
Thank you.
I don't know if it's a question or something I want to put it out there, but as Matt was talking about justice and the differences we hold and how similar we are because we hold these differences. I was thinking like how much in order for us to kind of like recognize who we are, we need those tensions and we kind of like create somehow. I was looking to the chords and I was like thinking that the tension kind of like reveals the original shape of it, because when it's kind of like, I don't know this word in English. It's kind of like creates a kind of like illusion of the shape of it. But in tension, you kind of like see the original shape, but if it's too much, it starts to distort again. So I was thinking that like, as you were talking about like justice as what love looks like in public, or that which corrects what was against love. And for me, it kind of like in my imagery world, it felt like something that kind of like balances the tension that is needed to reveal the shape, like our original shape, but like doesn't make us go too much in the illusion of, stretching too much or too less. And I was thinking how much I attract all the time in my life, tensions and paradox. And when that happens, I recognize who I am way more than when I am, in peace. But then it becomes too much, and then I can't deal with that anymore. And I feel that like we like justice for me feels also something like the learning of how to maneuver the need to like recognize our original shape or the core of who we are, and like go back and forth in that process. And as we learn to do that with ourselves, like together, like because we need the others also to like rebalance and like be in the other shore. Like it's hard to cross the path only on your own if you don't recognize all of these tensions that and all the suffering that is kind of like happening together with others. So I really appreciated like what you brought about this, the different ways of thinking about justice that made me go to this place, you know, and reflecting on my own life and things that have been happening and how much it is important like to have tension for me. And also it's so hard. Yeah. So yeah, I want to thank you all because like it kind of like built up like as you were, you know, talking each of your own ways to see it. It kind of led me to all this reflections and insights.
It's a beautiful image that you shared. I like that. So building on that, a socially just or just society would be one wherein each member of that society was able to actualize their true shape in with the proper amount of tension between the differences of that compose that society. Right? So yeah, it's always a tension. Justice wouldn't just be that we're all sort of sleepwalking and in lockstep with one another. You know, it would be more of a creative tension. I love that image. Yeah, thanks for offering that.
Yeah, I don't think lived tensions will go away too soon. We'll always suffer. But here's one thought that hopefully is evocative is you know, the idea of justice and equality. I think somewhere folded in that is there a deep sense of kind of this idea of merit. Merit. So you know, will I deserve to be part of the group, or you know, is there a rubric for you know, kind of an entitlement to just be, you know. I wonder if sometimes we cause our own suffering and the suffering of others because of this idea of merit. Oh, they're not good enough to be in our group. Right? We don't say, oh, they're on their path to be who they are, and they're just right. They're perfect the way they are. Right? Or that, you know, even in this tradition, the idea is not you will go to the Pure Land when you awaken. There is not this idea of merit. The idea is you're already saved. Relax. You know, and the worse you are, the probably the more you will realize compassion, because you realize you're accepted even just the way you are. So that puts a lot of stress away from I don't know, something to do with trying to make these distinctions about who's good enough and who's not good, who's part of my political understanding and who isn't. Yeah, I mean, even as an instructor, you know, I tried to think about, you know, certainly we're in a system, of course, that runs on merit. Who's going to get the A's? Who's going to get the B's? Right? But can we hold a space in which the student feels that whatever happens was just? Can we create a space in which what happens in this system of merit is just? And where does that come from? Oh, do my points add up? You know, so often that's how things are adjudicated if a student protests their grade, right? It's like, no, your points don't add up to get that A. Your points add up to be a B plus. You know? Even so, the student could add before that, right? And so somehow it still does not feel just. And why is that? Because perhaps the experience of the learning for that person was deep, but it didn't result in the A. Right? So what can happen here? You know, if the faculty member is in relationship with a student, perhaps the B plus doesn't feel punitive. Perhaps it feels just. Perhaps something else is offered here other than the adding of points and adjudicating based on the facts of the matter. There's a complex depth here that somehow we don't mind, is what I'm trying to say. And maybe part of it is we're too attached to a meritocracy. We already know that, you know, it's not a level playing field. So playing this meritocracy game is unjust. You know, but maybe it's not just that it's not a level playing field. Maybe it's not just equal opportunity. You know, they're never gonna recruit me for the Lakers. I should say the Warriors now. But you know, it's just, I don't, you know, that's not my realm, right? But there's something about how we're holding, I think, this merit and who gets in and who doesn't. Is when that's the exclusive system and there isn't a system where people are seen for who they are or what they can be, then it falls down. Then we start getting petty about the numbers and
Well, we're a little bit over, so perhaps if you, yeah, I mean, how do we feel? Do we want to go over? I don't want to make a choice.
maybe one quick question.
Yeah, would it be all right if I asked one quick question of clarification? I wanted to ask if it might be accurate to summarize by saying that the way that spirituality might influence social justice work, it might not necessarily change the content of that social justice work, but it might change the process, whether it's addressing the core delusions so that we can, approach it with joy and love rather than fear or greed, and from a place of equanimity without attachment to the outcomes. So with that, I wanted to know how you feel about that summary.
I think it's a fair position. I don't know if it totally captures all
the
perspectives offered, but I appreciate that perspective on how the two can intersect.
I think it's a shift in consciousness, and that's important, and that can lead maybe to, if one holds stock in the impact of subjective, energetic, or subtle factors, a shift in consciousness can, at some point, precipitate into a shift in conditions, conditions. And that's a conviction of mine.
Thank you. That was clarifying.
Yeah, I think so. And thank you very much. For me, I think I was talking about the idea of my lived life. My lived life is not so perfect, right?
Sure.
Right? And so there's something about being in the mindset of it is that. And it's okay, and we keep trying, and it moves on, and maybe we get this precipitating effect. But yeah, it's not necessarily, I think it's very easy. If you know that you're going to New York, then you kind of figure out where you're going to stop, where you're going to rest, where you're going to have coffee, where you're going to have dinner, da da da. But I think we're on a journey that we don't know what's on the other shore.
Right.
We don't know. We just keep being and keep putting effort. And what else have we done?
Right.
Wonderful way to close. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for being here. If you do have a couple more minutes to fill out the survey, that would be helpful for us. If you do not, I will not be offended. I will dispense it. Thank you for joining us virtually, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rick.
Thanks, everybody.